Hey folks, Professor Finn here, and today we're going to be looking at Chapter 5 of your embalming textbook, and we begin our study of the changes that occur in human remains from the point of death. We will look at the agonal period or the agonal period, which is the time immediately preceding death, all the way to point of death, the types of death, and changes that we can expect. So let's get into it. So, to the layperson, death may be thought of as the point where the last breath is drawn. In truth, death is a process and not a single moment in time. The dying process can be described as an expanding inability of the body to sustain the physiologic and metabolic processes that are necessary for life. It is a series of physical and chemical changes that begin before the legal pronouncement of death. The key things to take away from this are as follows. 1, there is a definition. Okay, there's a definition here. And it is a process. Okay, it is a process. These changes result in a cessation of integrated tissue and organ functions, loss of heartbeat, cessation of spontaneous breathing, and absence of brain activity. And there is a point in this process when life can no longer be sustained. When reached, death is final. Then changes will continue post-mortem after the person dies. So the agonal period. Prior to death, during the agonal period, the person declines and is actively dying. This person is said to be moribund or actively dying. Important definition there. This period cannot be measured in defined parameters. It could be quick due to fatal injuries, or it could be slow as in the case of chronic illness. In my personal example, and I've talked about my father during a live cast that I did on YouTube, that he was in a period of slow decline for a couple of months. And then some weeks prior to his passing, he was actively in the process of dying. And then he lasted for another almost 2.5 to 3 weeks, I think it was. So there could be a prolonged period where certain signs are indicating that something is coming, but it is not easy to determine what the timeline is going to be. I have sat with people at the arrangement table and working with a client family because someone is passing away, and they leave to come make the arrangement, speak to the funeral director for about an hour, hour and a half, and kind of put things on paper. And the hospice nurse calls and says, hey, it's happening now. They got to leave. It is really difficult to measure in definite terms how a timeline occurs. It can be very, very sudden, even if things look apparent to be good. When it is prolonged, signs of imminent death may be indicated. So the first is a death rattle, a gurgling or rattling in the throat caused by the accumulation of mucus and exacerbated by the loss of the cough reflex. Another important indication is the death struggle, a reflexive twitching of the muscles marking the final efforts to sustain life. There are some excellent YouTube channels out there. One that I would recommend if you want to know more about this particular phenomena is offered by a hospice nurse. So if you do a YouTube search, you will find an influencer who is a hospice nurse, and she actively posts videos about these processes so you can kind of see what's going on. Don't want to name drop her because I haven't reached out to her and say, hey, could I name drop you in my whatevers? I go ahead and search, and away we go. If you are that hospice nurse influencer, by all means, shoot me an email. Happy to include you as a direct reference in my presentations. Somatic death comes from the word soma, which means body. The body loses the ability to sustain physiologic and metabolic activity, and somatic death is defined as death of the entire body. Somatic death proceeds in an orderly fashion. Clinical death, brain death, biological death, and then finally post-mortem cellular death. So clinical death occurs when spontaneous respiration and heartbeat irreversibly cease. You can no longer breathe and your heart is not beating. Brain death occurs in a sequence of events that are a function of time without oxygen. The cerebral cortex dies within the first 5 to 6 minutes. Next comes the midbrain, and finally the brainstem. And the way to kind of visualize this is it starts in the front. These are your higher functions that make you as a human being. It then goes into the midbrain, and finally the last thing to die are the autonomic systems of the body. Once that goes, your brain is done. Biological death is the irreversible phase of somatic death and represents the cessation of simple body processes. At this time, the organs in the body no longer function. Finally, you have postmortem cellular death, and this is the process during which the individual cells die. So you can cease respiration, your heart can stop, your brain can die. Cells are still living after that. Cells still have fuel and are going to be using those things up until they run out of energy. After that, your cells will inevitably die. And that's what this slide talks about. Even as a person dies, there is a surplus of oxygen, nutrients, and other elements at the cellular level, so cellular metabolic activity will continue. Once the surface is depleted, the cells are overcome by the autolytic processes within and without them and die. The more complicated the cell, the quicker it dies. A way to kind of wrap your mind around that is the more complex the engine, the quicker things can break and go wrong. So, very important slide here. Cells and their time periods. Brain and the nervous system last about 5 minutes. Muscle cells 3 hours. Cornea and blood cells are 6 hours. Cells have a life cycle just like larger organisms. When they die of natural causes, this process is called necrobiosis. Cells can also die as a result of disease processes, and when they die as a result of disease, this is called necrosis. Two very important terms. Cells are born, they grow old, they die. Necrobiosis, natural lifespan. A cell dies as a result of a pathogenic cause, a disease process. It is necrosis. It is basically, necrosis is cellular murder. There are certain indications of death that are common. The cessation of respiration, the cessation of circulation, muscular flaccidity. Muscles become very loose. This is known as primary flaccidity. Changes in the eye, such as clouding of the cornea, loss of luster of the conjunctiva, flattening of the eyeball, dilated and unresponsive pupils. Postmortem lividity, blood pooling, rigor mortis, Algor mortis or postmortem cooling, and decomposition. So let's start with changes during the agonal period. The length of the agonal period has a direct influence on the postmortem changes of the body. A prolonged agonal period increases the likelihood of the embalmer will encounter complications due to disease process, increased risk of secondary infections, and increased tissue changes and chemical imbalances due to drug therapies. So when searching the internet, try to find the best of the hot trash to add to my presentations. It's always kind of been my go-to. And one of the things that I found were people reporting found dead bodies. There were not actually dead bodies. So here we have a picture of a mannequin that was found in a field. This is not a dead body. This is actually a sex doll that washed up on shore somewhere. My heart goes out to the person that dropped it off their boat. But life is stranger than fiction, truly. These changes can be generalized to changes on the temperature of the body, changes in the ability of the blood vessels to circulate blood and other liquids, changes in moisture content of the tissues, and translocation of microorganisms. So first up, let's talk about temperature changes. There are two temperature changes during the agonal period. Agonal algor, which is the cooling or decrease in body temperature prior to death, and this is common when death occurs slowly. And then agonal fever, which is an increase in body temperature just prior to death. This is common with infection, toxemia, and certain types of poisoning. And elevated temperatures increase microbial growth. So now we're going to start getting into the bread and butter of how these changes impact what we do as embalmers. Now, if we have cooler temperatures, typically microorganisms will not proliferate. Okay, there are some then when you study pathology, you'll learn the proper terms for this, okay? But what you're going to run into is the colder things are, typically the slower they're going to want to grow. This is why we want to put bodies into refrigeration to slow down chemical decomposition processes and the proliferation of microorganisms. They don't like the cold. If you have this burst of heat, microorganisms like heat, and they will begin to breed. That means when the person passes away and their immune system shuts down, there will be more of these microorganisms in the body. And this is something that concerns us as embalmers because, as you'll see later, we have to factor in when we inject a preservative solution, this is not just going to react with the cells of the body, this is going to react with also these microorganisms that are proliferating. There are 3 circulatory changes in the agonal period. First is hypostasis, the settling of blood into the dependent tissues of the body. And hypostasis can occur both in the agonal period as well as the postmortem period. As your heart stops, as it slows down, it has trouble pushing fluid into areas of the body. As that pressure drops, the fluid will then start to settle. This is hypostasis by definition. It's just the pooling of blood because now gravity can grab that liquid and hold it down, and there's not enough to push it through the system. Agonal coagulation happens as the blood slows down due to hypostasis and clots. And finally, agonal capillary expansion occurs as cells demand more oxygen, so the capillaries open their pores in an attempt to accommodate them. Your capillaries are basically lawn soakers. And your body is a very complex machine. And as you are dying, the cells still want oxygen and nutrients. And one of the ways your body tries to accommodate that is it takes the small capillary pores and expands them in an effort to bring more nutrients from the capillary system into the tissue spaces. As a result of that, not just nutrients go through, but liquid as well. So more fluid, the medium in which all these nutrients are suspended, is going to flow into the tissue spaces. There are 2 changes in tissue moisture. The first is agonal edema. This is an increased amount of moisture or fluids in the tissues of the body cavities, and I just explained why and how that is. This can result from disease process as well as from capillary expansion. And then, if the water is going somewhere, that means water is likely being taken from somewhere else, so you're going to have agonal dehydration. Tissue fluids gravitate to other areas of the body and create a shift in the moisture balance. If the body is laying at an angle, fluid is going to pull from the top into the legs. One area may become edematous as the fluid flows in, while the tissues that lost the fluid dehydrates. If they're propped up on a pillow, fluid from the top of the arm may flow down into the lower arm and hands. The top of the arm will become dehydrated. Agonal capillary expansion causes the capillary pores to open, and as I've stated, not just oxygen flows through these openings, fluids as well. Now, a very important topic for us here is the translocation of microorganisms, and that is the movement of microorganisms from one area of the body to another. Organisms defeat the body's failing immune system and other natural defenses, and then they're able to move around as the body dies. And most of these microorganisms reside in your gut. Translocation occurs as 1, the organism having a natural motility. In other words, it has a flagella or something else can actually push it around your system. The organism has entered your bloodstream and is now circulating to other parts of the body. So once it gets into your vascular system, really the only thing that polices your vascular superhighway is the white blood cells as traffic cops. If they're not looking, the microorganisms can use that system to spread throughout your entire body. And then finally, your blood, microorganisms, nutrients are all suspended in a liquid. And if the liquid is gravitating to dependent areas of the body, everything in it is going to gravitate as well, including the microorganisms. So they will move as a result of hypostasis or shifts in tissue moisture. There are 2 types of chemical changes, physical and chemical. Postmortem changes become more pronounced with the passage of time. These changes continue during the time between death and embalming. As the time increases, complications as a result of the changes increase as well. This is why we want to embalm as quickly as possible after death. The sooner we can arrest those changes, the better product we can provide if we're doing our jobs well. So the physical changes, the physical postmortem changes, very important list. Algor mortis, dehydration, hypostasis, livor mortis, increase in blood viscosity, and endogenous invasion of microorganisms, also known as translocation. The chemical changes are postmortem caloricity, changes in pH. pH is also known as the Sorensen scale. Rigor mortis, postmortem stain, and decomposition. So physical changes are produced by the forces of nature. Physical changes rearrange molecules. Natural forces cause changes in the physical state of the body tissues, but do not change the chemical composition of the body. Chemical changes are generated by chemical activities that result in the formation of new chemical substances. At the molecular level, chemical change involves making or breaking bonds between atoms. These changes are largely dependent on autolytic enzymes which stimulate chemical reactions between substances found in the tissues. I have a whole lecture on how this works in the chemistry playlist, how these autolytic enzymes work. In a nutshell, for purposes right now, quick review, in order for these chemical changes to occur, you need an enzyme, you need water as basically the spark, and then you need a fuel, you need a substrate, you need something to which the water and the enzyme can act on. So in organic chemistry, we have carbohydrates. Now to break down a carbohydrate, we have to have water. We have to have an appropriate enzyme, in this case sucrase, and then we have to have a carbohydrate. And if we have those three things, we can break it down. First up, we have Algor mortis, the post-mortem cooling of the body over time. The rate at which a body cools is dependent on a number of variables. There are intrinsic factors within the body and extrinsic factors in the surrounding environment, and both of these are going to influence how quickly a body cools. So what are the intrinsic, the factors inside the body? This is not a matter for discussion. If it's on the list for intrinsic factors, it is the intrinsic factor, and that's how you need to look at this. The first is ratio of body surface area to body mass. Body temperature at time of death, and the combination of both of those things. So how much of that surface area of the body is exposed, and how hot is that body at time of death? If you have a fever, it's going to take you longer to cool down than if you were at normal body temperature or already cold because of the fact that maybe your systems are failing. During life, body heat is lost to conduction, radiation, and convection as blood circulates through the superficial vessels of the skin. Blood is warmed again as it circulates back through the body's internal organs. A larger body will have more surface area to lose body heat, but the potential to lose heat can be offset by the mass. A smaller body will have less surface area and would therefore require less body mass to offset the loss of heat. In death, there is no opportunity for the blood to regain lost heat because there is no circulation. If a body has larger surface area from heat that can be lost, its temperature will decrease more rapidly unless there is something to offset the potential loss of heat. A body with more mass, insulation, will be better insulated against heat loss and cool at a slower rate. Fancy way of saying, the bigger and thicker you are, the slower you are going to cool down because all of that fat adds insulation. And Pyrrhic victory here, this is former Ozeki Tochinoshin, who is now a retired sumo wrestler. So that is why we have the whole thick comment on there. The Georgian Bear, great sumo rikishi of his time. Intrinsic factors. Infants are more likely to cool faster because they have a higher ratio of surface area as compared to body mass. If the body temperature is elevated at the time of death, it will then take longer to cool, as we've already discussed. Temperature can increase as a result of increased metabolic activity, the presence of fever, and the inability of the body to regulate its temperature. So we're either processing things higher than normal. Our body's generating more heat. You have a fever, which is usually quite common because of infections. And then finally, you have some sort of disorder where your body just can't regulate its temperature, so you're running at a higher temperature. Temperature can decrease as a result of exposure to cold, that's not a hard one, and the inability again of the body to regulate its temperature. Rapid cooling of the body by refrigeration or natural means helps to slow the onset of rigor mortis. And we're going to study in depth why rigor mortis is important to us, or at least important to embalm prior later in the course. Slow decomposition and keep the blood in a liquid state. Rapid cooling will more likely cause discoloration from livor mortis and discoloration from postmortem staining. Again, with everything that we do in human preservation, for everything good, there is an accompanying bad thing that needs to be brought up and discussed. And we're going to be looking at those things in depth in future chapters. So, extrinsic factors. And again, this is the list. This is what you memorize. There is no interpreting this. If it says body coverings is an extrinsic factor, it is the extrinsic factor. So clothing or other coverings that protect skin from direct exposure to the environment are going to matter, as well as the surrounding environment. Water will conduct heat away from the body quicker than air. So if it is in the winter and you are lying on the lawn, you're going to cool down fairly quick. If you are lying in ice cold water at that same period, you're going to cool even quicker. So hypostasis is the process by which blood settles as a result of gravitational movement within the vessels to the dependent or lower parts of the body. Hypostasis is the process by which blood gravitates, and livor mortis is the discoloration. We typically in industry might be talking about livor mortis like it is hypostasis. This is kind of like HIV and AIDS. HIV is the causative agent. AIDS is the syndrome that results from an HIV infection. Hypostasis is the process by which blood gravitates. And as the blood pools in certain areas, you then have livor mortis occur because livor mortis is the discoloration. So, hypostasis. Designation of dependent changes on how the body is positioned because fluid will always flow in the direction of gravity. So if I am laying on my back, the dependent area of my body is going to be my back. If I am rolled on my side, the dependent area of my body is going to be my left arm if I'm rolled over onto my left arm, and all the tissues in that area, including my face and legs. Gravitational movement of the blood is affected by constrictions, ligatures, and other factors that may impede free movement of the blood within the vessels. So you may have a ligature, you may have a bandage, you may have something constricting, and you will find that fluid and blood aren't flowing in there, and instead they flow above it and then stop, and that area becomes edematous instead. Livor mortis can result, or hypostasis can result in contact pallor, in areas where blood movement has been inhibited. It is most obvious when the body has been in contact with a surface. So if you look at the photograph here, and these photographs come directly from your textbook, what you're going to see is me not having the pen set up appropriately. Let's get that taken care of. The area where you have contact pallor is right here. You see this white zone where the skin was in contact with something, and as a result, it depressed the capillary beds. So the blood pooled all around it, but did not enter those areas. So as a result, all these dark purple-red areas became stained as the blood decomposed, and the areas that didn't have that did not have that level of discoloration. Now, when it comes to livor mortis, this discoloration can be removed because it is still in the blood vascular system. Postmortem stain, once it exits that blood vascular system, it's stained and it's not going to go anywhere. So what are the factors that lessen viscosity? Refrigeration, medication, and disease. Factors that thicken viscosity: heat, medication, and disease. So the first thing is these two, medication and disease, can either make fluid more wet or fluid less wet. Refrigeration will cause fluid to be retained over time. You won't evaporate fluid from inside the body as quick. Heat will cause the body to lose fluid and things will thicken over time. And as professional embalmers, that is something that is a major concern to us. Livor mortis is a post-mortem intravascular discoloration that occurs as a result of hypostasis. It can also be known as post-mortem lividity or cadaveric lividity. This all refers to the same exact thing. You die, fluids pool, the blood pools, and you turn pink in those areas where that blood is pooling. It can first be noticed as a dull reddish patch approximately 30 to 90 minutes after death. As it becomes more established, it takes on a deep reddish blue appearance. Livor mortis can be reduced or removed during the embalming process as embalming solution displaces or flushes the pooled blood from the capillary beds of the area. Two factors play an important role in the degree of intensity of livor mortis: blood volume and blood viscosity. If you have less blood to pool, you're going to have less discoloration, which is why if you have a person that is injured and bleeds out, you're likely not going to have very severe livor mortis or post-mortem discolorations in areas of the body where there's no blood. If you have thicker blood, it won't flow as much, and as a result, it may not pool as quickly or stick to the areas it's already in. So dehydration is defined as the loss of water and fluids from body tissues. There are two factors that cause this: surface evaporation and hypostasis or gravitation. Surface evaporation results from the passage of air over the surface of the body and exposure to direct air currents. Maintaining coverage of the body, use of moisturizing agents, and preventing direct air exposure help to reduce dehydration. So we have a pretty nasty hand here. You can see that we have some degloving going on. If you look up here, you can see where tissue is torn. And there are some areas where you can clearly see some brownish discolorations. And what's happening there is things are dehydrating. Things are dehydrating. Another thing that you likely had going on here is severe edema prior. And as things dehydrated, the skin started to separate. And then you have the complicated hand that you have here. So this would be a pretty, this would be something that any competent embalmer can address, but certainly this is not an ideal situation to start with. Elevated or non-dependent areas dehydrate more quickly as fluid is lost. As these fluids settle, they cause a condition known as postmortem edema. Imbibition can also lead to postmortem edema, and imbibition is the ability of the cells to draw moisture from the surrounding area into themselves. Now, there is a big difference between water that has flowed into an area and water that has been absorbed by the cell. We're going to learn about two different types of edema. Pitting edema, which is water is in the area, and solid edema, which is water is in the cells. They have two completely different ways of being addressed from the embalming analysis. As dehydration occurs, the blood becomes increasingly viscous and the formed elements of the blood stick together in clumps, a process that creates what is referred to as sludge. Dehydration causes tissues to darken, shrink, and wrinkle. Initially, this is a yellow or reddish hue, and as dehydration progresses, it turns into brown to black. Very important sequence. The sequence to discoloration, the sequence to dehydration, the colors go from a normal color to a yellowish color to a brown color to a black color. Dehydration, as is discussed right now, is strictly discussing dehydration prior to embalming. Dehydration can occur during embalming and post-embalming, but it's very important that we are discussing right now dehydration that is occurring as a natural process. If dehydration occurs during or after, that can incur liability. And this is why it is very important as practitioners that if you notice dehydration on a body prior to starting the embalming procedure, you must notate it. Because if you don't notate that it was there before you started, then it must have happened after you had finished. So you really want to make sure that you are adequately describing the conditions of the body on your embalming reports before you begin a procedure. Viscosity refers to the thickness of a liquid or its resistance to flow. Water flows pretty readily. If you add flour to water, you go from flowing not nearly as nice to flowing pretty hard to forming a dough, which doesn't flow probably at all depending on how stiff you make the dough. Blood has 4 components: plasma, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And the liquid component of blood is plasma. Plasma is a mixture of water, sugar, fat, protein, and salts. As tissue moisture is lost to the surrounding air, remember your pores are little vents directly to the atmosphere. Air passing over those holes will cause moisture to leave your body. As tissue moisture is lost to the surrounding air, plasma moves through the capillary walls into the tissue spaces. Surface evaporation continues the drying process, and then the products that are left inside the vasculature thicken, clump, and then cause clots and inhibits drainage, which complicates the embalming process. Translocation is also known as the endogenous invasion of microorganisms. Following somatic death, the barriers of the tissues undergo a loss of structural integrity. The fences start to break. This permits a body-wide translocation or redistribution of the systemic microflora. All body fluids and body tissues can become reservoirs of infectious agents within a relatively short post-mortem interval. Endogenous invasion of cerebrospinal fluid by bacterial agents associated with the colon occurs within 4 to 6 hours of death. 4 to 6 hours after you die. Things that are involved in the lowest portion of your digestive tract, the microflora of your colon, can be found in your spinal fluid. That is how quickly these things can get through the gates and into areas they shouldn't be. The colon is designated as the postmortem origin of indicator organisms recovered from extraintestinal sampling sites and seems to be the primary source of many of the translocated microbial agents. This is not surprising. We have an awful lot of microorganisms in our digestive system, and left unchecked, they can do really bad things. The postmortem multiplication of systemic and translocated recoverable microbial agents may begin within 4 hours of somatic death and reach peak densities within a 24 to 30 hour postmortem interval. So basically within a day and a half, you are running into the fact that your body is at its highest infectious level as a result of translocation of microorganisms. Postmortem factors contributing to the translocation of endogenous microflora include chemical and physical changes of the body, movement and positional changes of the body, passive recirculation of blood from contaminated body sites, thrombus fragmentation and relocation, and inherent true motility of intestinal microorganisms. Translocated organisms can exit any type of body opening and contaminate any surface. They can also aerosol. Droplet infection particles are aerosoled, and dried particles are droplet nuclei. So part of the fun is as you are transferring a body, as you are moving a body and the mouth is open, air can cause microorganisms to expel into the environment around us. That's one of the great comedies that I find in funeral service. There are going out with dignity policies where a person's face remains uncovered as you take them out of the nursing home or the hospice unit or wherever, whatever facility has these policies. And the truth is, that's perfectly fine, but really the body needs to be wearing a mask. If that person passed away and has tuberculosis, you're trekking it right through the hallway, and every time your wheels move or hit something or jiggle because they hit a flap of a carpet, that could cause a pressure differential that can spew microorganisms into the atmosphere. So that's one of the grievances that I have, is that sure we can and we want to maintain a person's dignity, absolutely, but we also need to protect the people around us. And if we just simply put an N95 mask on the individual as we bring them outside, that is an easy way to prevent any sort of contamination. Clostridium perfringens, an anaerobic spore-forming bacillus, is responsible for tissue gas in cadavers and gas gangrene in living patients. This little guy can cause serious problems for embalmers within 1 to 2 hours, and by problems, I mean massive problems. It can be so bad that viewing may not be recommended. You do not want to play around with this stuff. It is an extremely nasty microorganism, and probably one of our greatest concerns as professional practitioners. There are 5 postmortem chemical changes. This list is important. Rigor mortis, postmortem stain, postmortem caloricity, shifts in pH, and decomposition. So postmortem caloricity is an increase in temperature after death. People, for some reason, always confuse postmortem caloricity with agonal Algor. This should not be confusing. One happens when you are alive and one happens when you are dead. Agonal fever can be confused with postmortem caloricity. Again, this should not be confusing. Agonal means you are alive prior to death. Postmortem means the exact opposite. So do not let this stuff get in your head as to what's before death and what is after death. Metabolism is defined as the sum of all chemical reactions that occur within a cell. Metabolism is dependent upon oxygen and is separated into 2 phases, anabolism and catabolism. It is during the catabolism that heat and energy is produced. Because the cells produce heat as they live on after death, the energy is released into the body, which elevates in temperature. As your cells are working, they're little engines. Engines produce heat. Your body, the tissues around the cells, are gigantic heat sinks, is the way to look at this. Postmortem stain is the extravascular blood discoloration brought about by the hemolysis of blood. Hemolysis is the breakdown of blood. Hemolysis is the rupture or destruction of red blood cells. Important definition there. Blood settles during hypostasis and forms the discoloration called livor mortis. Postmortem stain is a chemical change. It is the breakdown of something. Livor mortis is a physical change. It is the blood moving in some dependent area. They are progressive. As the blood pools, it'll start to break down, which causes the stain. That is the way to look at this. About 6 to 10 hours after death, these blood cells break down and the components leak into the tissue spaces and permanently discolor them. Rapid onset of hemolysis is frequent during mortuary refrigeration and in deaths from carbon monoxide poisoning. Hemoproteins, or heme, is the component of hemoglobin responsible for the red pigment in blood. This discoloration is known as postmortem stain because now it has migrated into the tissue spaces and has become an extravascular discoloration. Extravascular discolorations are permanently fixed in the tissues as a stain. Livor mortis can be flushed. Postmortem stain cannot. Your tissues are now permanently discolored and you're going to have to approach it from a cosmetic solution in order to hide it. Tardieu spots resulting from the rupture of capillaries can appear approximately 18 to 24 hours post-mortem. These also do not respond to embalming and will appear as dark, pinpoint hemorrhages in the same dependent areas as livor mortis and post-mortem stain. In time, they may leave a marbling pattern in the tissues as things decompose. So we have an excellent looking picture here. I'm just going to kind of draw this block separate. This is contact pallor, more than likely. If we had to work with the terms we know right now, this would be contact pallor because we see there is no discoloration whatsoever. We do see, however, these areas here where we have a pink discoloration, and within that pink discoloration, within that bruise, we have these little dark pinpoints where the capillaries have broken down. These are Tardieu spots. Okay, these are Tardieu spots. When you see Tardieu spots, the important thing to understand here as practitioners, these are little holes now. That didn't happen by magic. That means when you inject this area with solution, you may encounter increased swelling because it's not going to flow into the tissue spaces. It's just going to flow and fill the opening that because the capillaries have broken down. Tardieu spots are very common in slow deaths and death by asphyxia. Deep breath. Now we get into shift in body pH. Degrees of acidity or alkalinity of a substance are expressed in pH, also known as Sorensen. The neutral point where a solution is neither acidic nor alkaline is pH 7. It's right in the middle of the scale. Increasing acidity is expressed at numbers less than 7 with a maximum of 0. This is real life, folks. Things happen as I am recording. Increasing alkalinity goes up from 7 to a maximum of 14. So from 7 down, it's an acid. From 7 up, it's a base. Each unit on the scale represents a logarithm, and there is a tenfold difference between each unit. So every number that goes up, it's multiplied by a factor of 10. Normal pH for a body is approximately 7.4. Hugely important number. 7.4 normal body pH. After death, blood pH drops and tissue fluid moves into the acid range approximately 3 hours after death. The body remains acidic during rigor mortis and then gradually becomes increasingly alkaline as decomposition advances. Muscle cramps, okay, if you work out, whatever, muscle cramps are generally caused by a buildup of lactic acid. Your body is, your cells are producing waste byproducts, and your body is not capable of flushing them efficiently or quickly. As a result, the muscle seizes until the waste products can be removed, and then the muscle goes back to running normal. Rigor mortis is a gigantic body cramp. As rigor mortis spreads, as the muscles go into rigor, as they lock down, as they cramp, you have lactic acid building up all throughout your body. So as this rigor mortis goes, you become increasingly acidic because of all this lactic acid buildup. And then what happens? The lactic acid breaks down. And as it breaks down, it starts going in the opposite direction. During life, oxygen prevents the buildup of lactic acid by oxidizing it into carbon dioxide and water. After death, the oxygen is gradually used up during postmortem cellular metabolism, and lactic acid begins to accumulate in the muscle tissues. This buildup of acid begins approximately during the first 3 hours after death. It is closely and directly related to the cycle of rigor mortis. The pH will drop to an acid level of approximately 6.0 and has been as low as 5.5. That is literally more acidic than milk. It is almost as acidic as some bananas. It's not quite as acidic as orange juice. As the result of the acid buildup in the tissues, conditions become right for the breakdown of the soft proteins of the body. There is then a gradual buildup in the tissues of nitrogen products such as ammonia and amines from decomposition. As the body contains much more protein than carbohydrates, this overwhelms the acid and causes the body to shift to the alkaline zone. Rigor mortis is the post-mortem stiffening of muscles by natural processes. This condition affects only the muscles, and usually all of the muscles of the body are infected. Once the condition passes, it does not recur. So you have a great example of rigor mortis over here. You can see that this person is in such rigor that the legs do not flex at the knee because the muscles are completely frozen in cramps. On the other side, you have a hand that is clutching debris, and those fingers will not move because the muscles are locked and the tendons can't move. Usually the muscles are relaxed as death occurs. This is called primary flaccidity. We've already learned about that in this lesson. So you die, you go flaccid, that is primary flaccidity. If the body's embalmed right now while the muscles are flaccid, the muscles are still in good condition, the proteins are going to react very well with the preservative, and tissue fixation is going to be ideal. If the body's embalmed while rigor is fully developed, stiffness is going to impede distribution, proteins are tightly bound, and they're not going to be as reactive because there's going to be less opportunities for the formaldehyde to hit the protein and react with it. So what's going on here? It's going to impede distribution. If I have a hose, right? If I have a hose and there's nothing pushing on the hose, water's going to flow just right through the hose. If I start to contract the area around the hose and I force it and compress it, it's not going to flow nearly as well. As your muscles are locked into place, water's going to start, or preservative fluid is going to start going through your vasculature, and as the fluid is going through, it's going to want to expand, but it can't because the muscles around them in certain areas are going to prevent that from happening. So it creates issues with your distribution. Instead of this, you're getting this. That smaller hole causes problems, especially if you have coagula and other stuff in there that you can rip off and then push downstream and block where you're trying to go. Within 36 to 72 hours, rigor mortis will pass naturally. This is called secondary flaccidity. During secondary flaccidity, there will be a greater demand for preservative because muscle protein has broken down to some extent. Okay, great way to visualize this, right? If I have a square, a 1 foot by 1 foot square made of Legos, okay? I have connections on the top, I have connections on the bottom, right? I can take that square and I can put it on something, or I can put something on top of that square. But the only connections that I have are the top and the bottom. If I start breaking the square into smaller pieces, there are more connections. That's what's happening during rigor mortis. Proteins are very complex, long things, and they have reactive centers that things can attach to. But as they break down into their components, there becomes more areas for attachment, which means you need more preservative to react with all those extra components. That is what's happening. Once rigor mortis passes, you get secondary flaccidity. Now the body's going to be flexible again. So posing it and getting into a position you want, not going to be an issue. Getting it preserved to the level that you want, going to be a harder deal right now. Going to probably need different chemicals, higher concentrations. We'll talk about those things. Rigor results from the body's inability to resynthesize adenosine triphosphate, ATP, that causes the muscle protein to lock together and form an insoluble protein. Rigor mortis marks the end of muscle life and is generally observed in the average body 2 to 4 hours after death. When you hit rigor mortis, that means your muscle cells are dead. The minimum temperature at which rigor occurs is 32 degrees Fahrenheit because below that, it freezes. The ideal temperature is 98 degrees because that's your normal body temperature. Up to about 100. Rigor mortis is halted if the body temperature is elevated above 120 degrees Fahrenheit and if the body is exposed to temperatures below freezing. Rigor involves all the muscles at the same exact time, but it becomes more evident in these smaller muscles. You may hear preceptors say it begins in the eyes, begins in the head, and moves to the larger muscles, moves to the legs. Starts in the eyes, ends in the legs. This is called Nystein's Law. Okay, this is called Nystein's Law. What's happening here? Muscles are like cups, okay? If you have an 8-ounce cup and you have a 40-ounce cup, as you start to fill the 8-ounce cup with broken down wastes, lactic acid, it's going to fill quicker, it's going to freeze up first. The larger muscle, even though you're filling it at the same exact rate, can still hold more, it can still function, it's still going to remain loose. Starts in the smaller muscles because the lactic acid builds up quicker, and then progresses to the larger ones because it takes longer to fill. And, all things equal, it will leave the eye first because it started there first, and leave the legs last because it started last. Rigor mortis can be relieved by flexing, bending, rotating, and massaging the affected joints, and once relieved, rigor does not return. Cold stiffening is a condition which may be mistaken for rigor and is caused by solidification of body fats and tissues during exposure to cold temperatures. Now, very important thing here. When you are relieving rigor mortis, you may be tearing muscle tissue. And when you tear the tissue and you inject it, don't be surprised if it swells. That is a very important thing to understand. When you go into massage, you're not going in and doing deep tissue massage. You are lightly massaging, firmly massaging, but you do not want to overdo it where you start tearing and ripping the muscle fibers, which will cause swelling. Cadaveric spasm is associated with rigor mortis. This is a sudden involuntary movement or convulsion brought about by involuntary muscle contractions. When rigor mortis occurs irregularly in different muscles, it can cause cadaveric spasms. Do not be surprised if a limb starts to articulate, if something starts to tap. There was a Nicolas Cage, Sean Connery movie back in the day called The Rock, and Sean Connery is playing basically an older James Bond, and when he murders someone, some terrorist, the foot starts tapping after death, and that would be a Hollywood-emphasized form of rigor mortis. Decomposition is the process by which dead organic substances are broken down into simpler substances. Decomposition of living organisms begins after death. The three major biochemicals in the body are proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. Proteins, sugars, and fats. Of the three, proteins are the most important from the standpoint of structure and function. Proteins play a number of roles in the body function and can be described as essential elements to the living body. Proteins are also essential to embalming. Successful embalming is achieved by establishing cross-linkages between proteins of the body and proteins of the microorganisms. We're chemically changing the way this protein is. When we do that to a living microorganism, we kill it. Proteins are large molecules that contain elements of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. The chemical bond that links two proteins together is called a peptide bond, also known as a peptide linkage. Again, jump into the chemistry playlist, go to the organic chemistry section. We talk at length about this there. During decomposition, the protein chains break down. Think of it as one gigantic Lego chain, and as it's broken down, it fragments. If the breakdown was caused by catalytic enzymes, the enzymes are called proteases. In human remains, the enzymes of decomposition have two different sources, saprophytic bacteria and lysosomes. Saprophytic bacteria will translocate and proliferate using dead organic matter for their nutrition. The way to look at autolysis, okay, which is the automatic breakdown of cells. It's either going to happen because a microorganism is eating you. Saprophytic bacteria, they eat dead things, okay? That is why they're breaking it down. They're using it as fuel. Lysosomes, that's their job in your cell. A lysosome's job is to break things down. And what's going to happen is when it has nothing to work on, it's used, the things it normally breaks down no longer exist. It looks for anything else to break down. During life, organelles called lysosomes contain the digestive enzymes of a cell. As the pH changes from alkaline to acidic, the membranes surrounding the lysosomes ruptures. As the cell's own digestive enzymes are released, they digest the surrounding cellular materials. This process is called autolysis, which means self-decomposition. All of these enzymes are stored in a container. When the container ruptures, because your body's producing acid at an astronomical rate, these enzymes are then released and they start wreaking havoc on everything. The products of autolysis are amino acids, sugars, fatty acids, and glycerol. These substances are sources of food and energy from which microorganisms can increase the rate of decomposition. You're basically breaking down into their food. Hydrolysis has been called the single most important factor in the initiation of decomposition. It is a chemical reaction by which the chemical bonds of a substance are split by the addition or taking up of water. Autolysis in the human body is essentially a hydrolysis reaction. When hydrolysis occurs, water is broken apart, another compound is broken apart, and new products are formed. So this requires water, a catalyst, and compound. This is very much like the combustion triangle. You have to have oxygen, you have to have fuel, you have to have spark. Hydrolysis, you have to have water, a catalyst, and a substrate. Hydrolysis is the first chemical reaction in the putrefactive process. During hydrolysis, large protein molecules are broken down to smaller fragments called proteoses, peptones, and polypeptides, and all of these are good food sources for bacteria. As degradation continues, the final products are amino acids. Big thing, protein. Smaller thing, proteose, peptones, polypeptides. You break those down even further, you have amino acids. Amino acids undergo even further chemical changes. Amines, carbon dioxide, water are some of the products. Amines are organic compounds that are considered to be derivatives of ammonia. Ptomaines, or foul amines, are a group of malodorous amine compounds formed by putrefactive bacteria. These are so bad they are commonly called corpse odors. Their names indicate this: indole, scatole, cadaverine, and putrescine. Decomposition of the tissues and organs within the body is called putrefaction. It is also known as the decomposition of proteins by anaerobic bacteria, whereas decay is the decomposition through biological and chemical agents. It is also known as the decomposition of proteins by aerobic bacteria. One of the ways you can remember this is decay aerobic. Decay aerobic. Decomposition, putrefaction, anaerobic bacteria. As long as you can remember decay, aerobic, they share that same vowel sound to some extent, that will help you memorize the difference between decay and putrefaction. Hydrolysis requires the presence of a catalyst. If you just have a fuel and you just have spark, you have no burning because you have no oxygen. So in this case, you have water, you have a fuel, you don't have anything to actually start it up. Catalysts are a substance that influence the rate of a chemical reaction without itself becoming part of the products of that reaction. Enzymes found within cells act as catalysts. In the presence of water, enzymes begin to digest the carbohydrates, fats, and proteins of the cell. As proteins hydrolyze, the resulting products make more and more sites available for union with the preservative, and this greatly increases the preservative demand of the body tissues. Remember the Lego wall. If it's solid, connections on top, connections on bottom. But as you start breaking it down, you start having more and more connections that you need to attach things to. The rate in which hydrolysis occurs is speeded by heat, slowed by cold. A mild acid pH can also stimulate hydrolysis. As the process continues, more nitrogen end products are produced, which causes a shift to alkaline. This new environment is ideal for bacterial growth, and the process of putrefaction greatly increases. As mentioned previously, a catalyst is a substance that speeds up the rate of a chemical reaction without itself being permanently altered in the reaction. A great way to envision this is a trigger, okay? You have a bullet in a gun. It can sit there all day, nothing's going to happen. When you squeeze the trigger, something happens, bullet gets launched. The trigger doesn't change, right? The trigger's still going to be there. As soon as you can load something back up and squeeze the trigger again, it's going to go. It's exactly the way these catalysts work. They initiate the reaction. Then they stop. They have to recharge, and they go again. And they do it again. They stop, they recharge, they go again, and they go and go and go and go until they themselves finally break down. In every chemical reaction, there is a transition state where chemical bonds of reactants are broken and a new chemical bond is formed. At this point in a reaction, there is a higher level of energy needed. The boost of energy is provided by the catalyst, and enzymes serve as the catalyst and are influenced by temperature and pH. In short, after you die and your muscles build up lactic acid and this acid dissolves your lysosomes, it releases all your enzymes. They then go bonkers and start creating the perfect environment for microorganisms by breaking these complex things down into smaller things, and the microorganisms go, oh look, someone opened the buffet. Now the breakdown of carbohydrates does not have any significant effect on embalming. Carbohydrates are stored in the body as glycogen, which are broken down during fermentation. Fermentation is the breakdown of carbohydrates under aerobic conditions. The products of this breakdown are organic acids, but they are not produced in sufficient quantity or strength to alter the overall alkaline environment that exists in a decomposing body and do not produce any foul odors. The final products of the breakdown are carbon dioxide and water. Now, what's the problem? Even though they don't create more compounds and problems for us, it creates more water. As a result of the more water, it speeds up the hydrolysis. As a result of the carbon dioxide, it increases the anaerobic environment, which most of these microorganisms love. So it speeds that up. As a result of the breakdown of the carbohydrates, that carbon dioxide is a gas. It starts to inflate your body. It creates swelling. So even though the breakdown of carbohydrates isn't really a major issue from the preservation standpoints, the results of that breakdown can be very catastrophic for us because it accelerates decomposition and then causes unsightly swelling. Lipids. Body fats are broken down by hydrolysis that occur in a process that occur as a result of enzymes called lipases. Okay? Lipase, fats, lipids. Sucrase are your carbohydrates, and proteases are the ones that break down your proteins. The products of this breakdown are glycerol and fatty acids. These byproducts do not significantly affect embalming because they do not change the alkaline environment, nor do they give off any foul odors. What's the good news about this? As lipids break down, they don't even cause swelling. They cause some nasty things, but really nothing like creating more water. You might say, hey, it breaks down to glycerol and fatty acids. If you look at a lipid molecule, okay, what you're going to find is there is a huge molecule. That's usually the glycerol, okay? That's the glycerol molecule. And attached to this are little tails that come off of it. So we hear things called triglycerides, right? Triglycerides. And what you have is you have a molecule with 3 attachments. That's why it's a triglyceride. So all these names reference something that you can visualize, that you can draw out to help you memorize what they are. The final product of fat decomposition is adipocere, commonly called grave wax. If you've seen the movie Fight Club, you know that they take human fat and make soap out of it. This is loosely what is happening to your fats when they become grave wax. You can see all this white material. This is grave wax. Okay, this is grave wax. You can differentiate this from mold because you don't see any of the green associated with the mold, nor do you see any fibrous elements coming off of the body. Adipocere is a grayish-white waxy substance caused during the hydrolysis and hydrogenation of lipids. Adipocere formation favors warm, moist environments with anaerobic conditions. In other words, it has to be warm, it has to have some water in it, and can't have a lot of oxygen. Otherwise, you typically dry out. Adipocere is resistant to bacterial action and remains stable for long periods. Hey, that's great. If you form grave wax, then it can't be broken down. Yeah, but the problem is you have other issues. Forensic exhumation studies illustrate the ability of adipocere to slow decomposition even after a century. Decomposition proceeds at different rates in various body cells. Cells, tissues, and organs that contain high levels of moisture and autolytic bacterial enzymes break down before similar structures that contain less water and less enzymes. This is why, as practitioners, depending on the way a body is positioned, depending on what is happening, you may have decomposition running rampant in one area of the body and the rest of the body is completely fine. A person passes away and their head is below the chest. Water starts flowing in there. You have all sorts of decomposition going on there, but the rest of the body from the neck down is perfectly fine because all the water went to the top. The order of decomposition of the body compounds. Very important list. Carbohydrates, soft proteins, fats, hard proteins, and bones. Carbohydrates, soft proteins, fats, hard proteins, and bones. Not hard to remember. Your body does not like to burn fat. It'll burn carbohydrates before it burns fat, right? So carbohydrates are up. Soft proteins, now it gets to the fat, then it gets to the hard proteins, and finally the bones will decompose. The vascular system is one of the last organ systems to decompose. Even in advanced decomposition, it would be possible to inject some preservative chemicals in an attempt to slow decomposition and control odors. This would be difficult to achieve due to blood coagulation and sludge causing distribution and drainage issues. But that doesn't mean you don't try. And there are 5 classic signs of decomposition. This is hugely important. 5 classic signs of decomposition: color, odor, skin slip, gas, and purge. Decomposition in the dead human body is not a uniform process. It may be present in one area, but not in another. Decomposition can also be present without all 5 signs, and also with all 5 signs being present. Decomposition is a weird beast. The first color change that occurs in decomposition in an unembalmed body is a greenish discoloration over the right lower quadrant of the abdomen, generally around the place where the appendix and the short and long intestine meet. Or, I'm sorry, the short and the large intestine. This discoloration is caused by the combination of hydrogen and sulfide with hemoglobin from the blood. In many bodies, as the gas begins to grow, it follows the outline of the large intestine, which is just below the abdominal wall, which makes it really easy to stain the skin. Then it gradually starts creeping up to the chest, the neck, the upper thighs. As time progresses, the gas starts going everywhere. Blood trapped in the superficial vessels gradually break down, staining the surrounding tissues. That's what marbling actually is the breakdown of the blood reacting with the gas and turning things green. This purplish-brown discoloration is most pronounced in the veins of the shoulder, upper chest, lower abdomen, and groin. This type of discoloration is referred to as marbling or spiderwebbing. As proteins of the body decompose, putrefactive odors become apparent. This odor is caused by foul-smelling amines, mercaptans, and hydrogen sulfide. Desquamation is known as skin slip. The superficial skin layer weakens as deeper layers undergo autolysis. Hydrolysis of collagen and elastin cause the superficial skin to slough or slip. When you see what we have going on here, this is sometimes referred to as degloving, where basically the top layer of the skin just peels right off like a glove. As decomposition progresses, accumulations of gases and liquids form blisters between the layers of skin, and when the blister is ruptured, the skin easily falls off. As the superficial skin desquamates, the exposed skin is moist and appears shiny. Exposed tissue will rapidly dehydrate, firm, and darken. Whenever you have torn tissue like this, dead tissue, it is dead, it has to go. You have to get it off. All it is going to do is decompose and rot on you. So you might as well get it off now before it starts causing problems later. As decomposition progresses, gases begin to form in the viscera. This usually begins in the stomach and intestines, and later gases form in the body tissues themselves. Gas accumulation causes both the abdominal cavity and body tissues to distend. So we can see a body here in active decomposition. Look how good the flesh looks on the top. You can also see an ear right there. Ear looks like it's in pretty good condition, and chances are pretty good his face is in pretty good condition because all the blood, all the fluid is going towards here. And look what's happening at the bottom. This arm is completely in active decomposition. It's completely flooded with blood and decomposing. You have gas building up and liquid forcing the skin off the abdomen because, again, like I just said, the collagen elastin is breaking down, the skin is flexing down, and you have the fluid basically dripping off the front. Very unfortunate, but from a practitioner standpoint, this honestly is pretty ideal for us just from the pretense that the visible area of the body there is going to be fine. Your probably biggest issues are going to be whatever's going on with the hands. Those hands are probably going to have to get hidden or placed in gloves. Gases in the tissues can actually be moved by the application of pressure. Gas wants to move, just like fluid wants to move. Crepitation is the movement of gas through tissues that, when palpated, creates a crackling sensation. So what you can do is make an incision and then literally push the gas out. If you've ever put a screensaver on your digital device, you'll know that you have to, it's easier if you wet the surface a little bit with an alcohol and then put the thing on and then squeegee all the air out. That's essentially what you're doing. You're forcing it out the nearest hole. Areas such as the eyelids, scrotum, and breasts easily distend with gases. In time, eyelids, cheeks, and lips distend, and the tongue protrudes. Finally, purge. Purge is the evacuation of gases, liquids, and semisolids from a natural body orifice. In decomposition, purge is generally caused by the buildup of gas pressure in the abdomen. The pressure forces gases, liquids, and semisolids along the path of least resistance, usually a body orifice. There is stuff inside of you. As the gas builds up, it starts pushing the stuff out. That's all purge is. Very important that you can recognize by sight the different types of purge, because that will tell you what is leaking from what hole. Stomach purge resembles coffee grounds and is generally acidic and foul-smelling. Lung purge generally appears frothy due to the presence of air bubbles. If blood is present, it will appear frothy red. They're both probably going to be coming out of the mouth and nose. But if you have frothy red stuff coming out, that's your clue that you probably have to just aspirate some lungs and you're good. If you have coffee grounds coming out at the same time, chances are pretty good you're going to want to do some double aspiration on the in the stomach area, and then probably inject and re-inject cavity fluid so that you get that under control. Stomach and lung purge usually exit from the oral and nasal orifice. So if you look closely over here, you can see that you have some particulate. Looks like coffee groundish, that's stomach purge. Foodstuffs can be seen. So more than likely, this person was in a position where over time purge was coming out the nose and mouth. Anal purge consists of fecal matter and exits the anal orifice. You can never have enough pressure to push backwards up through the system. It's always going to push through the lowest hole possible. So taphonomy is the scientific study of decomposition. It is also the study of processes that affect remains, burial, decay, and preservation. Dr. William Bass established the first forensic anthropology center at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. This facility is known as the Body Farm. These days, more people are familiar with the Body Farm than others. And I had a gentleman that I was an acquaintance with. His wife used to be a student of my program, and he willed his body to go to the Forensic Anthropology Center at the University of Tennessee. Scientists have established categories to describe rates of decomposition based upon time intervals: fresh, bloat, destructive or destruction, active decay, and dry skeleton. So you can see that fresh is about 1 to 6 days, bloat is 7 to 23 days, so about a month. Destruction, active decay is about a month to 2 months. And then dry skeleton within about basically the end of a 2-month period. And then there are stages within that. Your book has a variety of good information, good charts to pull information from when reviewing. So one thing that's very important when you're looking at this can be something that is highly academic. Okay, this can be highly academic and may or may not relate to funeral service outwardly. What is important is when you are in class, you are studying things like this because you may be asked a question on it. When you are studying for your national board exams, and I have videos on my channel about studying for your national board exams, it is very important to look at the National Board Exam Study Guide produced by the International Conference of Funeral Service Examining Boards to see if something like this can be linked to a job task analysis that creates the framework for the national board exam. And you might say, well, Professor Finn, we don't have access to the job task analysis to determine that. And I'm going to tell you again, please review the National Board Exam Study Guide, which has content outlines and professional expectations, which are based off of that job task analysis. And if you cannot match something reasonably, such as this taphonomy stage, chances are pretty good that might not be something you have to put a lot of time and effort into when preparing for your national board exam. So these are the subtle differences between studying for school and studying for national boards, simply because the national board exam is created based upon the feedback of practitioners in the field and what people are doing at funeral homes. This, at the moment, may not be something extremely important to practitioners. It may be something important 5 to 10 years from now. So when these things are added to textbooks, do what you need to pass the class. When you're studying for your boards, approach it from a little bit of a different perspective. Now, things like this: antemortem hypostasis, postmortem, livor mortis, postmortem stain. These are very important charts. These are very important charts. And you can take these and make some very useful study aids out of this. So for instance, you can take a column now and just put intravascular, right? And then you can start adding these terms to make, hey, what are my intravascular discolorations? Very quickly, you now have a column that just tells you what they are. You don't have to look to see, is it intravascular? You're looking to see only intravascular. You would be surprised how creating these things yourself makes you more effective as a student. You also have a chart of the chemical and physical changes of the body. You're not here to overanalyze these and try to convince yourself that something is the other way. If it says it's physical, it's physical. It's that simple. If you notice there is a correction that needs to happen in the book, you should let your professors know or reach out to the American Board of Funeral Service Education and say, hey, I noticed this typo. Typically, if you let your professor know or your program coordinator know, they will reach out and let the American Board know so that the book can be properly updated, or at least a notice sent out to the programs that a deficiency has been noted in the textbook. Until the next correction, please make note of this. Test of death. Test of death. The legal pronouncement of death is a medical function. An expert test of death must be performed by trained and legally certified medical personnel. When you study funeral service history, you're going to find that for a great period of time in human history, doctors didn't sign death certificates. Like, period. That wasn't a thing. The reason why they started was because of the fact that the insurance agency was getting hosed because people were literally killing their kids in England and claiming life insurance because, they'd had 5 or 6 kids, losing 1 or 2. Hey, it's worth about 10 grand. So doctors started getting involved to show that no foul play was there. So a stethoscope is an instrument used to mediate sounds produced in the body. This instrument would be used to listen for sounds of respiration or cardiac activity. Some morticians have stethoscopes for whatever reasons and uses they have. Others don't. I actually have a couple of different stethoscopes, and that's because I typically have small dogs which suffer from cardiac arrhythmias. So I actually utilize a stethoscope to check my pet's health to make sure that if anything's getting more severe, I get them down to the vet. And they got some really crazy stethoscopes out there now with AI involved to augment the sound so you can hear better. Really, really crazy stuff. You have an ophthalmoscope, an eye instrument used to examine the interior of the eye, especially the retina. This instrument would be used to examine the blood vessels in the retina for signs of circulating blood. Because it is a light source, it could also be used to detect responses of the pupils of the eyes. There is no real reason for you as a funeral home to have one of these. That's just not something we would need. Electroencephalogram, an EEG, a record of the electrical activity of the brain, followed by an electrocardiogram, which is a record of the electrical activity of the heart. You then have an evoked response, which is a method of testing the functions of certain organs, even if the subject is unconscious or uncooperative. An auditory evoked response will appear on an electroencephalogram if the sound reaches the brain. Brain death would be one reason for the absence of such an evoked response. And now we come to the ones that you may be called upon to do if you are a county coroner in a very rural area, which is an inexpert test of death. An inexpert test of death does not legally confirm a death. Inexpert tests are carried out when the equipment and expertise required to perform an expert test is unavailable. So the first is fogging a mirror. A mirror is placed between the nose. Fogging can indicate that there is respiration. Ligature test. A finger is ligated with a string or rubber band. Blood circulation can be indicated when the ligation causes swelling or discoloration of the finger. This is the adult equivalent of holding your finger tightly and watching it turn red. That's basically what you're doing is a ligature test. You have the ammonia injection test, where a small amount of ammonia is injected subcutaneously. A localized reddish skin reaction can indicate presence of life. You really do not want to be injecting people with ammonia to see if they are alive. Just saying. The good old-fashioned test for a pulse. Digital pressure is applied to a pulse point, and a beating pulse can indicate heartbeat. The common areas don't matter, whether it's the neck or the wrist, whatever floats your boat. And finally, listening. An ear is placed over the chest of the individual. The sound of breathing or heartbeat can indicate presence of life. Folks, that ends this lecture. We will see you next video.